They turned off the lights while I was in the shower. At first, I thought it was just a flicker, one of those usual power blips that happen now and then in old houses. But then the laughter started. Soft, stifled giggles that seemed to bounce against the tiled walls, muffled voices whispering just beyond the bathroom door. I stood there, wrapped in the steam, trying to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe they had just knocked the switch by accident. But accidents do not come with smirks and whispered secrets, and certainly not when they happen repeatedly, like a pattern stitched into the fabric of my days. I was 82 years old, and I had lived through winters colder than this one, but nothing felt colder than that moment in the darkened bathroom, standing wet and alone, hearing the world on the other side carry on without me. My name is Eleanor. I live now in a small rented apartment on the edge of town, a place where the streets curve like gentle promises and the windows catch the afternoon light just right. It is modest and quiet, but it is mine, in a way that the house I lived in with my daughter and son-in-law was never mine, no matter how many years I spent there. That house had a roof and walls and warmth, but it was a fortress built around exclusion and silent wars fought with flickering thermostats and the subtle erasure of presence. I suppose in a way that's how I ended up here, writing this, by way of dark bathrooms, cold winters, and the slow unraveling of what family means when it stops being a refuge and starts feeling like a prison. I never imagined I would leave the home of my daughter, the woman who once cradled me as I recovered from a bad fall, who promised me comfort and care in my last years. But comfort came in forms I hadn't anticipated. It was not the soft touch of kindness or the warmth of shared laughter. It was the calculated silence of those who no longer had room for me, who learned to speak around me instead of to me. At first it was subtle, a misplaced cup here, a forgotten conversation there, the gentle shifting of the furniture so that my favorite chair disappeared without explanation. The small rituals of belonging began to erode until I was a guest in a home that was not mine. That night, when the lights went out and the laughter began, I felt the full weight of invisibility settle over me. It was not just the darkness of the room, but the darkness in their eyes when they looked away too quickly, the hesitation in their voices when they addressed me. I was there, yes, but I was no longer seen. I stood dripping in the shower, listening to the sounds beyond the door, the muted footsteps, the faint clicking of phones, the soft shuffle of feet retreating down the hallway. I did not shout or cry. There was nothing left to say that would reach them. Instead, I stayed quiet, counting the seconds until I could wrap myself in the worn bathrobe I'd brought from my own home, a small piece of the life that still felt like mine, somewhere deep beneath the surface. My body was tired, but my mind was wide awake, replaying every small indignity that had led to this moment. The subtle exclusions, the whispered comments about how Mom doesn't get around like she used to, the way my requests were met with sighs or shrugged shoulders, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the way my name was used less and less as if forgetting it would make me disappear faster. I thought about the winters I had survived before this one, the cold nights where I had wrapped myself in layers and kept the fire burning in the hearth because I was alone, but still whole. This night was colder than all of those combined because the chill was not in the air but in the hearts around me. I am not a woman who has lived an easy life. I raised my children with love and sacrifice, worked long years to put food on the table, and carried the weight of loss when my husband died too young. I have known grief and resilience in equal measure, but nothing had prepared me for the quiet cruelty of being made invisible in the home of my own flesh and blood. I could have stayed silent, bowed my head, accepted the shrinking of my world to a corner of the kitchen or a forgotten bedroom. But something inside me refused to be dimmed completely. There was a spark, faint but stubborn, that whispered I deserved better, that my years were not a debt to be erased, but a legacy to be honored. Now, in my small apartment, I find myself reflecting on those dark days with a mixture of sorrow and clarity. The flickering lights, the whispered laughter, the cold winter nights without heat. They were symptoms of a larger sickness, one that comes not from illness, but from the erosion of empathy. I learned that love can turn to neglect slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you find yourself standing alone in a dark bathroom, wondering if anyone will notice if you vanish. But I did not vanish. I made a choice. I turned off the heat in my old life so I could turn on the warmth in a new one. I closed the door on the house that no longer held me and opened the window to a world that, though uncertain, was mine to navigate. This story is not just about betrayal or rejection. It is about reclaiming dignity, about finding the courage to say no to invisibility and yes to the light I deserve. The nights are still long and the winters still cold, but I no longer stand in the dark alone. I carry my own light now, small and steady, enough to guide me through. And if my words reach another woman who feels unseen, unheard, or unvalued, know this: you are not invisible. Your story matters. Your warmth is worth fighting for. This is where I am now, not by accident, but by choice. And though the lights may have been turned off once, I have learned to carry my own flame. The moment that shattered the fragile illusion of belonging came quietly, almost without warning, but it changed everything. I had arrived at my daughter's house the previous spring after a bad fall that left me unsteady on my feet and in need of care. I thought I was stepping into a refuge, a place where family would surround me with love and patience as I healed and slowed down. But what I found was something much colder, much harder to bear. The early days were filled with polite smiles and carefully chosen words, the kind of hospitality that feels more like an obligation than a welcome. My pension was supposed to help with the bills, and I was glad to contribute, happy to ease the burden in any way I could. I watched the children grow, helped with their homework, cooked meals, and tried to tuck away the growing sense that I was no longer fully seen as a mother or grandmother, but rather a fixture in the background, a shadow that could be moved or ignored, at will. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I slipped into the bathroom for my usual shower. It was a ritual I clung to fiercely, a moment to wash away the dust and weariness of the day, to feel clean and whole again even when my body protested. The water was warm, running over my skin, and for a few minutes I allowed myself to relax, to pretend the world outside those walls had nothing to do with me. But then the lights went out. At first, I thought it was just a power failure, maybe a blown fuse or a circuit tripping somewhere in the house. I called out, but no one answered. I reached for the switch, but it was dead. The only light was the faint glow of the bathroom nightlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the tile. Then came the sounds, the muffled giggles and whispers, the scrape of footsteps retreating down the hall. I knew the house well enough to realize they had turned off the lights on purpose. It was a game to them, a cruel joke played on the old woman who had once been the center of this family. I wrapped myself in a towel and opened the door, stepping into a hallway that seemed colder, emptier than it had been before. The living room light was off, the kitchen dark, the house holding its breath as if waiting for me to disappear. I called my daughter's name softly, but there was no reply, only silence that pressed against me like a physical weight. The next morning, I confronted her gently, asking if the lights had gone out during the night or if it had been a mistake. She looked at me with an odd mixture of pity and irritation and said, "It was just a fuse, Mom. You're imagining things." That was the beginning of the unraveling. The small kindnesses faded away and were replaced by thinly veiled exclusions. I started noticing little things. My favorite chair missing from the living room, replaced by a new recliner that everyone else seemed to use but me. My clothes, which I carefully folded and stored, began to vanish or be shuffled to the back of closets. Food that I bought and placed in the fridge was moved, labeled with unfamiliar handwriting, and sometimes discarded with the explanation that it was expired or not right for the kids. When I asked, I was told I was forgetful, that I didn't remember correctly, or that it wasn't worth making a fuss about. The house felt less like a home and more like a carefully controlled exhibit, where my presence was tolerated but never fully embraced. One day, my granddaughter, barely 10, came to me with a hesitant smile and whispered, "Mom says you should try to eat less dairy. You're lactose intolerant now, Grandma." I hadn't complained about milk or cheese, hadn't mentioned any stomach troubles. I realized then that they were rewriting my reality, scripting the story so that I would be easier to manage, easier to push aside. It was a subtle form of control, the kind that leaves no bruises but slowly erases you from your own life. I found myself retreating more and more, choosing quiet corners and empty rooms where I could be alone with my thoughts, away from the whispered judgments and the polite but cold smiles. Winter arrived with a harshness that seemed to echo the growing distance in the family. The heat would mysteriously go off for hours, sometimes overnight. I learned to layer blankets and keep a hot water bottle close to my chest, but the chill seeped into my bones and made it harder to sleep. When I asked why the thermostat was set so low, I was met with excuses about rising gas prices or the house being old and drafty. But I knew the truth. Someone was turning it down when they thought I wasn't looking, testing how much discomfort I would endure before complaining. On the worst nights, I found the window in my bedroom cracked open, the latch broken. When I mentioned it, my daughter shrugged and said it must have been the wind, or maybe I forgot to close it properly. But I never forgot, and I knew who else was home. One afternoon, after a visit to the doctor left me feeling weak and vulnerable, I overheard my son-in-law on the phone, his voice low but sharp. "The hospital bills are piling up. We're not made of money, you know. Maybe Mom needs to consider a nursing home." Those words hit me harder than any cold shoulder or silent treatment ever could. I realized then that my presence was not a cherished blessing, but a burden, a weight on their shoulders that they were eager to shed. The warmth I had hoped to find in my family's home was a facade, and beneath it lay a desire to push me out, to reclaim their lives from the obligations I represented. The final straw came one bitter January night. The snow was falling thick and fast, blanketing the world outside in white silence. I had wrapped myself in every blanket I could find, clutching a cup of lukewarm tea and trying to keep the chill at bay. When the heat went off again, I called out to my daughter, but there was no answer. I found the thermostat taped down to the lowest setting, the batteries removed from the portable heater I had brought with me. It was clear. I was no longer welcome. The house I had called home had become a place of cold neglect, a cage of subtle cruelty disguised as concern. That night, I packed what little I could carry and left. I took my savings, the small emergency fund I had squirreled away in a hidden envelope, and rented a basement apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was not much, but it was warm and mine. I put up new curtains, bought a kettle for tea, and began the slow process of rebuilding a life that had been quietly stripped away. I left a note taped to the thermostat in the house I had vacated. I learned to live with less. Now you will too. The light is yours to switch, the warmth mine to reclaim. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a declaration that I would no longer be made invisible in the lives of those who should have loved me best. In the months that followed, I found strength in the small things, volunteering at the local food pantry, making friends with neighbors, learning to navigate the city bus system again. The shadows of my past lingered, but they no longer defined me. I learned to carry my own light, to turn on my own warmth, and to believe that even in the darkest moments, there was a spark worth holding on to. This was my catalyst, the moment when betrayal became the first step toward freedom, when rejection opened the door to a new kind of belonging, one built not on duty or obligation, but on choice and self-respect. The days that followed the first clear act of exclusion passed with a slow, creeping heaviness that settled over me like a thick fog, dulling my senses and clouding my hopes. It was not a single moment of cruelty or a sharp word spoken in anger. Rather, it was a series of small, deliberate omissions and subtle changes that chipped away at the foundation of my existence in that home. The light being switched off while I showered was just the first stark symbol of a larger, unspoken war waged in silence. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice the almost imperceptible ways in which I was being pushed further and further to the margins, my presence slowly erased as if I were a ghost whose outlines were becoming fainter by the day. One of the first signs was the disappearance of my favorite chair from the living room. It was an old, well-worn recliner, the fabric faded and the springs a little too soft, but it was mine, a small sanctuary where I could sit and watch the afternoon light play across the walls while knitting or simply resting my weary bones. One afternoon, I returned from a walk to find that the chair was gone. In its place stood a sleek, modern recliner, one that belonged to my son-in-law's idea of style and comfort, but which felt cold and unfamiliar to me. When I asked about the chair, my daughter gave me a tight smile and said, "We needed to make room for the kids when they visit. You can sit on the sofa." The sofa was fine, but it was not mine. It was a public space, not a private one. It did not offer the same quiet refuge. I began to see my belongings moved, rearranged, or simply vanished. The basket of yarn I had kept by the window was emptied and placed in a storage closet with the label, "Mom's Things." My slippers, which had always been left by the back door, were nowhere to be found one morning. When I mentioned it, no one seemed to know what I was talking about, or they forgot to check. The house was filled with things that were not mine, while the things I held dear were slowly taken away, packed away, or ignored. I felt as if I were living in a house that was a stage set, where the props were carefully controlled and the script did not include me. Food was another battleground. I'd always taken pride in cooking for my family, preparing meals with care and love. But now I found my groceries moved to the back of the refrigerator or hidden behind containers, labeled with unfamiliar handwriting. Once I found my favorite yogurt, the one I always ate for breakfast, thrown away with the reason "expired" scrawled on a sticky note. I knew the yogurt had been good for another day or two. My granddaughter, who was 10 and growing more confident every day, began telling me that I should eat less dairy because I was lactose intolerant now. I hadn't complained or mentioned any stomach troubles, but the message was clear. They were rewriting my reality, shaping a version of me that was easier to manage, easier to disregard. The thermostat became another symbol of my diminishing place in the household. I noticed the temperature dropping during the day, the heat switched off when I was in another room or asleep. When I asked why it was so cold, my daughter would shrug and say it was to save money, that the gas bills were high, and we all had to make sacrifices. But I knew better. I saw the thermostat set deliberately low when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The house was colder in the mornings, the corners of the rooms damp and chilly, and my breath would fog in the air as I wrapped myself in layers of clothing and blankets. The cold seeped into my bones and made it harder to sleep, harder to keep the loneliness at bay. On one particularly harsh night, I woke to find the bedroom window open, the latch broken. When I asked about it, my daughter said it must have been the wind or that I had forgotten to close it properly. But I had never forgotten, and I knew who else had been in that room. The cold was not just in the air. It was in the silence that followed, in the half-words left unsaid, in the way my presence was tolerated but not welcomed. I began keeping notes, a private ledger of slights and omissions that helped me hold on to my sense of self amid the growing erasure. I wrote down the times the heat was switched off, the food that went missing, the moments when my name was left unspoken or my requests met with impatience. Writing was a lifeline, a way to map the shifting landscape of my life so I would not be swept away by it. I found solace in the small acts of resistance, the quiet reclaiming of my space, the gentle assertion of my needs, even when they were met with indifference. In the midst of this quiet war, I also found moments of unexpected kindness. My granddaughter, despite the messages she received, sometimes lingered by my side, asking about the stories of my childhood or sharing secrets in hushed tones. The neighbor across the street, an elderly woman with a quick smile and soft eyes, would sometimes stop by with a plate of cookies or a friendly word. These small connections reminded me that even in the darkest places, light can find a way through. I also reopened a private bank account, one I had kept hidden for emergencies and independence. It was a small rebellion, a way to hold on to some control over my life and finances. With the few dollars I could spare, I began buying little things for myself: a warm scarf, a paperback book, a tin of good tea. These were not luxuries, but small affirmations of my worth and presence, tokens that said, "I am here." I took a part-time job at the local library's resale shop, a place where I could move among books and people without judgment, where I could earn a few dollars in cash and feel the steady rhythm of work once again. It was humbling but necessary, a step toward reclaiming my autonomy. The house, once a place of warmth and family, became a prison of silence and cold. The flickering lights and whispered laughter in the bathroom were only the beginning. The real violence was in the slow dismantling of my place in the world, the quiet erasure of a life lived fully but now deemed inconvenient. I learned to live with less warmth, less attention, less respect. But I also learned to hold on to the parts of myself that no one could take away, the memories, the resilience, the small acts of defiance that kept my spirit alive. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that the house was not my home anymore, that my presence there was a tolerated shadow, a fading echo. The cold was not just in the temperature, but in the hearts of those who once called me mother and grandmother. And so, with a quiet determination, I began to plan for a new life, one where I would be seen, where the lights would not be turned off while I was vulnerable, and where the heat would come not from a thermostat controlled by others, but from a fire. I kindled myself. The first escalation was not a single act, but a slow unraveling, a deliberate shrinking of my world. It was a lesson in invisibility and endurance, a trial that tested the limits of my patience and the depths of my strength. And through it all, I held on to a fragile hope that one day I would turn the key to a door of my own choosing and step into a life reclaimed from the shadows. In the midst of the relentless quiet that had begun to consume my days, there came a moment, a shift not marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by the small, deliberate acts of reclaiming what had been quietly taken from me. It was not a sudden awakening, but a slow, steady unspooling of the tangled threads of despair and resignation that had bound me. I began to write everything down, not as a ledger of grievances meant to wound or accuse, but as a means of clarity, a way to anchor myself in the shifting landscape of my life. Each slight, each omission, each cold room was noted, not to dwell in bitterness, but to remind myself that my story was still my own to tell. The act of putting pen to paper became a ritual, a way to gather my scattered pieces and start to see the outline of something new beneath the cracks. With a growing sense of purpose, I reopened a private bank account that had long been dormant, tucked away like a secret I was not quite ready to reveal. This account was my lifeline, a reservoir of independence and possibility that belonged solely to me. I began to set aside small amounts of money from my modest pension, hiding them in envelopes tucked inside an old, hollowed-out copy of Gone with the Wind, a book I had cherished since my youth. This quiet act of saving was more than financial prudence. It was a reclaiming of agency, a declaration that despite the cold indifference I faced daily, I would hold on to my dignity and prepare for the moment when I could walk away on my own terms. At the same time, I sought work, not out of necessity alone, though the money was welcome, but out of a deeper need to reconnect with a world beyond the walls that had grown so unwelcoming. I found a part-time position at the library's resale shop, a small, dusty place filled with second-hand books and the gentle hum of people seeking quiet refuge. The work was humble, involving sorting donations and managing the cash register, but it was a balm to my spirit. There, among the worn pages and familiar titles, I felt a sense of belonging that had long eluded me. The shop was a world of stories, and in handling those books, I was reminded of my own story, still unfolding, still worth telling. This new routine gave structure to my days and a semblance of control in a life that had felt increasingly chaotic. I purchased small comforts for myself, an extra warm scarf, a sturdy pair of gloves, a tin of good tea, and began to build a sanctuary within the modest apartment I had rented. Each item was a symbol of my rebirth, a quiet affirmation that I was no longer at the mercy of others' neglect or disdain. The walls, once bare and cold, began to fill with small touches that spoke of home. Photos of places I loved, a hand-woven blanket draped over a chair, a small collection of favorite books arranged neatly on a shelf. This was no grand palace, but it was mine, and in its modesty lay a profound sense of freedom. The cold winter nights were still a challenge, but I faced them armed with the knowledge that I had chosen this path, that each shiver was a price paid for reclaiming my life. I learned to light candles that cast a soft, steady glow, to brew tea that warmed my hands and heart, and to find comfort in the rhythms of solitude that no longer felt like loneliness. The silence of the apartment was no longer oppressive, but a canvas upon which I could paint my own rhythms and desires. I began to look forward to mornings when the light spilled through the window and afternoons spent reading or taking quiet walks in the nearby park. At times, the weight of the past pressed heavily upon me, the memories of cold rooms, whispered laughter, and the gradual erasure from the life I had once known. But I held those memories not as chains, but as lessons, reminders of the strength it took to step away from what no longer served me. I found unexpected solace in the company of a few new acquaintances, neighbors who understood the quiet dignity of aging and loss, fellow volunteers at the food pantry who shared stories of resilience and hope. These connections, fragile and tentative, were a balm to my soul, proving that even after deep betrayal, trust and kindness could still be found. The most profound change was within me. I felt a shift from victim to agent, from one who waits for rescue to one who chooses her own path. The act of saving, working, and creating a home became rituals of empowerment, each small victory reinforcing the truth that I was still capable of shaping my destiny. I began to speak more openly about my experiences, not with bitterness, but with a quiet strength that commanded respect. In the sanctuary of my new life, I found the courage to let go of the shame and silence that had once bound me, embracing instead a narrative of survival and renewal. This midpoint was not a dramatic turning point, but a subtle realignment, a moment when the slow unraveling of my old life gave way to the delicate weaving of a new one. It was in this space between despair and hope that I found my footing, learning to stand again on ground that I claimed as my own. The shadows of the past no longer dictated my steps. Instead, I moved forward with a steady heart and clear eyes, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In this quiet reclamation, I discovered not just survival, but the possibility of flourishing, a testament to the enduring spirit that refuses to be extinguished even in the coldest winters. The past has a way of finding you when you least expect it, like a shadow that stretches long across the floor as the sun dips below the horizon. Just when I thought the quiet sanctuary I had built was safe and separate from the coldness I'd left behind, the world I tried to escape began to seep back into my life through cracks I hadn't noticed. The second escalation was not marked by a single event, but by a series of intrusions, letters, visits, and whispered reminders that tested the fragile boundaries I had established and forced me to confront the unfinished business of family and history. It was a return of the past in a form both familiar and foreign, a reckoning with the ties that bind us, even when we try to sever them. The first sign came in the form of a letter, slipped under my door on an overcast afternoon when the sky hung heavy with the threat of rain. The envelope was thick, unmarked except for my name in a handwriting that was both familiar and painful. It was from Kieran, my oldest grandchild, the one who had always been kind and curious, the boy who once spent an afternoon with me building a birdhouse that he painted bright red and declared the coolest spot in the yard. His letter was short, filled with concern and cautious hope. He told me that his parents were worried, that they were searching and asking questions, that he missed me and wished I would let him know I was safe. The tenderness in his words was a balm to my bruised heart, a reminder that not all ties had been severed. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the warmth of that connection. I read and reread his words, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into the drawer of my nightstand, where it would be both a comfort and a secret. I didn't call him. Not yet. The wounds were still too fresh, the betrayals too raw. I needed time to heal on my own terms, to find my footing before reopening the door to the family I had left behind. But the past would not be kept at bay so easily. A few days later, Lisa appeared at the cafe where I worked, standing stiffly near the pastry display as if waiting for courage to find her voice. She was polished and poised, the daughter-in-law I had never fully trusted, the woman whose smiles often felt like armor. She didn't come inside but lingered just long enough for Heather to notice, her eyes scanning the room before she turned and walked away. That encounter left a bitter taste, a reminder that the world I'd left still watched and waited, not with open arms but with suspicion and judgment. Then came the lawyer, a man in a suit who arrived unannounced at the cafe one quiet afternoon. His presence was a reminder that family business was never truly private, that control and concern often came wrapped in legalese and formal warnings. He introduced himself as Derek Sorensen, representing Adam and Lisa, and he spoke carefully about their worry for my well-being and the desire to ensure I was in a safe environment. His words were polite but firm, a thinly veiled attempt to assert authority over a life I had reclaimed. I folded my apron and told him firmly that I was not a pet to be managed, that there were no next steps unless I chose them. I left the cafe without looking back, feeling the weight of their attempts to pull me back into a role I had long rejected. The pressure intensified with the publication of a newspaper article, a family statement that painted me as vulnerable and lost, a woman who had vanished without warning and left chaos in her wake. The article quoted Adam and Lisa, their voices shaped by fear and control, their words a performance for the public eye. I laughed aloud when I read it, a sharp sound that startled even me. They portrayed me as fragile, as someone who needed saving, but the truth was far different. I was not a lost cause, but a woman who had chosen freedom over the pretense of family unity. The article was proof that concern often masks control, that public worry can be a weapon wielded to shame and manipulate. Heather, the young woman who had hired me, brought the clipping to the cafe, her eyes soft with sympathy. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I told her I was never better, that the article was nothing but proof that people only start caring when they can no longer use you. It was a bitter truth, but it was mine to own. The cafe became a refuge, a place where I could work and be seen for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. Amid the turmoil, Arthur entered my life, a quiet presence who came in for coffee every morning, a widower with stories of birds and quiet wisdom. His visits were a gentle reminder that connection was possible beyond the tangled web of family drama. He didn't press or pity. He simply sat with me in the early light, sharing moments of companionship that felt real and unburdened. Our conversations about cardinals and finches, about crows smarter than people, often gave me a reprieve from the noise of my past. Arthur became a steadying force, a reminder that trust could be rebuilt in small, meaningful ways. Yet the return of my family was not without its sharp edges. Lisa's visit to the cafe, her hesitant apology disguised as panic over Kieran, her insistence that she wasn't trying to replace me but just wanted peace in the family, was a fragile olive branch wrapped in years of resentment. I listened as she spoke of panic and fear, but I saw through the veneer to the truth that she had never wanted me fully present, only as a background figure to be managed. When I told her I was not her shadow but my own person, something finally shifted. She left without finishing her coffee, leaving behind the weight of unspoken regrets. At home, Joyce, my landlord and reluctant confidant, offered no judgment, only quiet companionship. She watched the letters and visits unfold with a knowing eye and a steady presence. One evening, as we shelled peas in her kitchen, she asked, "You hiding or healing?" I answered honestly, "Both." It was the truth. The hiding had been necessary to survive. The healing was beginning to take root. The calls from Kieran became a lifeline, each one a thread pulling me toward a future that was not bound by the past's betrayals. He spoke softly, without guilt or expectation, simply reaching out to say he missed me and hoped I was safe. I answered him when I was ready, and in his voice I heard the promise of connection unmarred by obligation or pain. But the family's reach extended beyond visits and calls. The lawyer's letters continued, the demands for meetings and discussions wrapped in polite threats. I wrote back once, cold and clear, a statement that I was of sound mind, living safely and not under duress. I warned that further contact under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. It was a boundary drawn firmly in the sand, a refusal to be drawn back into a system that had long sought to control me. Despite the pressure, I felt a quiet strength growing inside me. Each intrusion from the past was met with calm resolve. Each attempt to pull me back met with a steady refusal. I was no longer the woman who waited for approval or permission. I was the woman who chose her own path, who guarded her peace like a precious flame. The visits, the letters, the public displays of concern, they were attempts to reclaim what they had lost control over, to rewrite the narrative so that I would fit back into the role they had assigned me. But I had rewritten the story for myself. The second escalation was a test of my boundaries and my resolve, a reminder that freedom is never given but fought for, often against those we love most. In the quiet moments between the storms, I found solace in small acts of rebellion. The choice to answer only the calls I wanted, to refuse meetings that served no purpose, to build a life where the heat came from within rather than from the flick of a switch controlled by others. Arthur's steady companionship, Joyce's unspoken support, and Kieran's gentle presence became my anchors in a sea of uncertainty. The past may have found me, but it would not define me. I was no longer the invisible woman left in a darkened bathroom or a cold bedroom with a broken latch. I was a woman who had learned to turn off the lights on their cruelty and light a fire in her own heart. The second escalation was not an end but a crucible, forging a new strength that would carry me through the challenges still to come. And so I stood firm, a quiet defiance in the face of intrusion, a steady flame burning bright in the winter's long night. The story was far from over, but I knew now that I held the pen. On the coldest night of January, when the wind howled like a warning and the world outside was wrapped in thick layers of ice and snow, I reached a point where endurance gave way to decisive action. The small apartment I had come to call home was a sanctuary I had painstakingly built from the fragments of my fractured past. But even sanctuaries demand boundaries, and I knew it was time to set mine firmly in place. The relentless attempts by my family to reclaim control, their thinly veiled concerns and legal maneuvers, the cold silences and whispered dismissals, they had taken their toll, but they had not broken me. This night, beneath the heavy quilt of winter, I made a choice that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, an irreversible step toward reclaiming my dignity and autonomy. The heat was off again when I returned from a brief walk to clear my head, the chill immediately pressing against my skin as I crossed the threshold. I had grown accustomed to the intermittent cold, to layering sweaters and wrapping scarves tightly, but tonight the temperature seemed harsher, more deliberate. I flicked the thermostat, but it refused to respond. The batteries I had bought with my own money were missing from the small heater I kept for emergencies. The harsh truth settled like frost on my heart. This was no accident or oversight. Someone had chosen to leave me in the cold, both literally and figuratively. I sat down at the small kitchen table, the thin wood cold beneath my hands, and took a deep breath. There, taped to the thermostat, was a note written in familiar handwriting, neat and deliberate. I learned to live with less. Now you will too. The light is yours to switch. The warmth, mine to reclaim. The words were not angry or pleading. They were a quiet declaration, a parting shot that carried the weight of years of neglect and silent battles. In that moment, I felt the full measure of what had been taken from me, but also the clarity of what I was about to reclaim. With trembling hands, I gathered what little I had left of the emergency fund I had secretly saved, $2,600 in cash tucked carefully in an envelope, and packed a small bag with the essentials I would need to start anew. There was no room for hesitation or doubt. I slipped out into the night, the snow crunching softly beneath my feet, and found my way to a modest basement apartment I had rented in a quiet neighborhood. The landlady was a kind woman who asked no questions, accepting the cash deposit with a nod and a smile that felt like an unspoken promise of new beginnings. That night, I lay beneath a worn but warm blanket, listening to the wind outside and the steady beat of my own heart. The apartment was humble, no grand furnishings, no inherited memories, just a space to call my own, free from the shadows of the past. I brewed a pot of tea, the steam rising like a soft prayer, and allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph. I had turned off the heat in the house that was not mine, but I had ignited a fire within myself that no one could extinguish. In the days that followed, I settled into a routine that honored my newfound freedom. I learned the rhythms of the neighborhood, the morning light filtering through frost-kissed windows, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, the gentle hum of life moving forward without me. I volunteered at the local food pantry, finding joy in giving when so much had been taken away. And I took long walks in the park, feeling the crunch of snow beneath my boots and the sharp, clean air filling my lungs. The winter was harsh, but it no longer felt like a punishment. Instead, it became a metaphor for my journey. Cold and difficult, yes, but also a season of transformation, a time when the old must fall away to make room for the new. I knitted scarves and hats to give away, each stitch a testament to resilience, and I wrote letters, not to those who had abandoned me, but to myself. In one, I wrote, "You were never crazy," just colder than they could stand to admit. Next time someone dims you, shine somewhere else. I refused to answer the calls and messages that flooded my phone, the frantic pleas and thinly veiled threats that sought to pull me back into a world I had left behind. Instead, I guarded my peace like a sacred flame, tending to it with quiet care and unwavering resolve. I understood now that the warmth I had sought all those years was not to be found in others' hands, but within my own. The act of leaving, of turning off the heat and walking away, was not one of bitterness, but of reclamation. It was a final cut, a severing of ties that had long since become chains. I did not carry anger with me, only the steady strength of a woman who had finally remembered her own worth. The cold nights no longer scared me because I had found the warmth inside, a light that no darkness could overcome. This was the climax of my story, the moment when survival became living, when endurance blossomed into agency. It was a declaration to the world and to myself that I would no longer be invisible, that my life belonged to me and me alone. The fire I lit that cold January night continues to burn, a beacon for any woman who has ever been left in the dark to find her own light and claim her rightful warmth. In the quiet aftermath, as the snow melted and the days lengthened, I stood at my window watching the world awaken anew. The house that once held me in cold neglect stood far behind, a memory softened by distance but never forgotten. I am here now, alive and unafraid, carrying a flame that shines steady through the darkest nights. This is my reclaiming, my freedom, my home. The mornings in my new life came gently, as if the world itself was learning to breathe alongside me. I would wake to soft light filtering through the curtains, the quiet hum of the city stirring outside my window, and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat reminding me that I was here, present, whole, and belonging to myself. The cold that had once seeped into my bones no longer held dominion over me. Instead, I carried a warmth that was mine alone, a quiet fire kindled from resilience and choice. In this space, I found a peace that had eluded me for years, a calm rooted not in forgetting the past, but in finally releasing its hold. I kept my routine simple, brewing tea each morning, reading worn books whose pages whispered stories of survival, and tending to the small garden of memories I nurtured within my heart. The apartment, modest and unpretentious, became a sanctuary where I could be fully myself, without apology or restraint. I no longer waited for permission or approval. I made decisions for me, by me. The heavy silence that once signaled exclusion was replaced by the gentle sounds of life moving forward. Birds outside the window, neighbors greeting each other softly in the hallways, and the occasional laughter that bubbled up from the little cafe, down the street where I had begun to rebuild my world. The letters from Kieran continued, delicate threads weaving a tentative bridge between my past and present. His words were cautious, but sincere, filled with questions and glimpses of a life I had once touched, but never fully entered. When I finally answered his call, our conversation was quiet and careful, not rushed or burdened by the weight of years lost. There were no demands or expectations, only a shared recognition of connection that had survived despite distance and silence. In his voice, I heard hope, a hope that perhaps, in time, we could rebuild something new, something true. I thought often of the woman I had been, the one who endured the cold nights, the whispered exclusions, the slow erosion of dignity. She was still with me, not as a shadow, but as a foundation, a wellspring of strength that had carried me through. I honored her by living fully in the present, by embracing the freedom that comes with standing alone and choosing oneself. The small apartment, the warm blankets, the steaming cups of tea, they were not just comforts, but symbols of a life reclaimed, a testament to the power of resilience. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I would write letters, not to those who had hurt me, but to myself, words of encouragement, of forgiveness, of understanding. I would remind myself that I was never truly lost, only waiting to be found again by the woman I had always been beneath the layers of pain and neglect. One such letter read, "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go, and you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done. Love me." Joyce, my landlord and companion in this new chapter, became a steady presence, sometimes a friend, sometimes a witness, always a fellow traveler through the complexities of aging and renewal. We shared meals and stories, the comfortable silences that come from knowing one another without the need for constant words. Her home smelled of lavender and fried onions, a scent that came to symbolize warmth and acceptance in my mind. Together, we celebrated small victories, the first paycheck I earned, the new friendships forged at the community center, the quiet moments of joy that made life worth living. The days grew longer, the seasons shifting with a gentle rhythm that echoed my own transformation. I learned to walk without looking back, to find beauty in the ordinary, and to welcome the unexpected kindnesses that came my way. The world, once a place of exclusion and coldness, opened again in surprising ways. I attended potlucks at the community center, shared lemon squares I had baked with hands that had once cooked for others, and felt the warmth of belonging without the price of erasure. When the family came calling again, letters, phone calls, visits, I met them not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. I did not close the door entirely, but I did not open it wide either. I held the boundaries I had fought to establish, choosing when and how to engage, if at all. The woman who had once been invisible was now a presence not to be ignored, a force shaped by years of endurance and the fierce determination to be seen on her own terms. At times, I caught glimpses of Lisa's face outside the cafe, a fleeting shadow of the past trying to find its place in the present. But I had learned that presence is not about proximity, but about respect and recognition. I stood firm in my truth. I was not her shadow to be cast aside or embraced at convenience. I was a woman who had finally remembered how to be whole. The final act of this journey was the letter I wrote to the lawyer, a formal and unyielding statement that I was of sound mind, living safely, and not under duress. It was a legal closure to a chapter marked by attempts to control and manipulate. I mailed it with a steady hand, feeling the weight of years lift with each step away from the post office. The act was both symbolic and real, a reclaiming of autonomy that no one could revoke. In the quiet aftermath, as I sat on the porch wrapped in a warm shawl with Franklin, the cat curled at my feet, I felt a profound sense of peace. The life I had built was not grand or perfect, but it was mine. It was a life forged from the ashes of neglect and the determination to rise. The fire within me burned steady and bright, a light for the woman I was and the woman I had yet to become. To any woman who finds herself in the shadows, unseen and unheard, I offer this story as a testament and a promise. You are not invisible. Your worth is not diminished by others' neglect or rejection. The cold nights will pass, and you will find your own warmth. You hold the key to your own freedom. Turn off the lights on those who would dim you and shine somewhere else, where your light is welcomed and cherished. This is where my story ends and yours begins, in the quiet power of choosing yourself, of walking away from what no longer serves, and of stepping into the life that is waiting for you to claim it.